Welcome to the Gravity Well podcast with me, Jenny Yeremy. I host the Gravity Well to celebrate and share the stories of people looking to empower others with the knowledge and skills required to reestablish stability in our communities. My mission is to work through heavy issues in conversation and process in order to lighten the load. I acknowledge that I live on the traditional territories of Treaty 7 and Métis Districts 5 and 6. The treaties and self-governance agreements established by Indigenous peoples were created to honor the laws of the land, maintain balance with nature, and give back to uphold reciprocal relationships. This knowledge and intention are what guide the Gravity Well conversations. I ask for genuine dialogue, real hearts, and openness to different perspectives. This is your invitation to find common ground with me. Positions taken by participants, either individually or collectively, do not necessarily represent those of the Gravity Well. This podcast is dedicated to the natural world, our children, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, and all future generations. The Gravity Well is on YouTube and streaming wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you see and hear, remember to like and subscribe. My mic is working properly, so I'm just going to say that again, just in case. I am giving you some updates of what's been going on in Alberta before I share a conversation I had with Dr. Younis Alila yesterday in Calgary when he was in town doing his screening for trouble in the headwaters. So again, I'm Jenny. I am in Calgary, Alberta, and I am a geophysicist by background. I became a liability expert. I'm now a social and environmental activist here on the podcast, The Gravity Well. Please remember to like and subscribe to this episode and any others that you listen to. Make sure that you get this valuable work that people are doing in Alberta out to the masses. For me, I can't do it without you. Thank you. So, firstly, I want to remind you that I had a great conversation a couple weeks ago with Michaela Resist. She is she works in the education field, and she also became an activist basically from seeing the effects that the Alberta government had on her job in public education. I spoke with Andy Sitsima, who walked us through what Project 25 is in the United States, led by the Republican Party, now in power under Donald Trump, and what it would mean for Alberta if we were to separate or, let's say, fall to the United States, which I want to share a little bit more about some information that's been out around that as well. And then I had a fabulous conversation with teacher Peter McKay, who's up in Grand Prairie. He was a bargaining chair for the Central Bargaining Committee for the Alberta Teachers Association until September, and is very aware of the crisis that Alberta education is facing. So please take a look at that conversation as well. It was a great reminder of what teachers did. So in September, it's very important to remember that it was extremely likely that the Alberta government was going to call a snap election. They really they thought they had the momentum of people behind them again, and they were going to use that and call an early election and hopefully secure another 4 years of their rule with us. So thank you, teachers, again, for striking, and thank you to the public for staying with the teachers and appreciating that public education is something that we all need to cherish and stand up for. Peter had a really important call to action for teachers. Stay political. Not talking about joining parties, but stay involved in politics. Make sure you are having conversations about politics and stay engaged, or become engaged if you aren't. Now is the time to show that we have to come together as a public to push back against this government's direction. So please listen to those 3 conversations. And then also please check out the few conversations that I've had the privilege of having with Charlie Angus on Midas Canada. So our last conversation, which is called Reclaim Alberta, People Who Have the Power, we discussed the U.S. foreign interference going on in Alberta, the attempts to create a fake constitutional crisis, led by our Premier Smith. And I mentioned the book, The Petroleum Papers, which is being made into a series, by the way. It explains the history of misinformation and manipulation by oil companies dating back to the 1950s and the impacts of these actions on climate policy and public perception. So why does it matter? Well, what we do matters. As a resistance community really does matter. We are making a difference, as I just outlined with the teachers. And it's really important to know that we have staved off the initial attempt to have a separatist agenda last summer. So just reminding people that we had Thomas Lukasik lead the effort of the Forever Canadian petition. That was to circumvent a question regarding separatism. He got the summer to help us understand why we should be reaffirming our commitment to this country of Canada and our commitment on a world stage to be honest and moving forward with evidence and with scientific information and with Indigenous knowledge as well. So I just want to make sure that you understand that this effort is not being measured in polls. And I'm going to get into a little bit of polling that's been going on too. So again, check out those videos with Charlie. He also ran the Midas, like a video of the Midas town hall he did as well in Calgary. So you can check that out too. And then the last thing I want to say around Charlie is that in May, there is an event by Public Interest Alberta. Charlie will be there. I will be there. I'm super excited to be talking about the work I'm doing post recall campaign and obviously around water that has been central in this conversation on the gravity well. Just a reminder that between the two campaigns that completed and submitted numbers, we have over 8,700 people who have written, express concern around the direction this province has been heading and helping us say no to that direction. Then I'd just like to remind you that anybody who is signing, you are doing public good by taking that initiative. Anybody working on this, you are doing public good by bringing people together. But the hurdle is tremendous, reminding you that to separate, to express sentiments of treason towards our country, you only need 5% of the population to be behind you in that effort. Where if you want to hold your MLA to account, you need 40%, approximately 40% of the population to be behind you in that. It really, please know that the numbers are not set up as fair, and your signature is a written example that you want your voice to be heard from this government. Despite that, it's really important to get your name on those, and also to remember that the people that are doing this work, it's really, it takes a lot of courage to do this work. So it's really important to support anybody you know doing these campaigns. Let your community know that the time is running out on a lot of these. Many of these are done this Sunday. So if you have a chance today, please sign those petitions. Go to Operation Total Recall and submit your address. You can put in your postal code and you can find your MLA that way. Find the easiest way for you to sign based on their websites or what is on that website, and get your signature on that list. And I will say that the messages that have been coming from the MLAs that were recalled have not been, they've been consistent with the way that they've expressed themselves in the past, which is that they really aren't concerned about their constituents' message of dissent, that they really aren't concerned that they are taking our rights away from us and telling us that it's happening to us by somebody else. So please know that I'll be specific. So our MLA, who is also your education minister, Demetrios Nicolaides, while he was on a journey to help understand family violence, he was putting up a flag of Alberta on an international stage. That was noted by journalists, caught that, and now he's posting a request for them to redact that story. Something that he did himself, really helps us understand where he stands in terms of his commitment to Canada on a world stage. And meanwhile, the family violence policies have been altered by this government under his control. So we are seeing an increased expectation of family violence based on some legislation that he has supported. So there's a lot of discrepancies that are happening with our leaders in this province, and they are not taking responsibility for it. These recalls have not had the impact of helping them understand that this is important dissent that they should be listening to, and they should be altering their activity. Again, the simplest thing that they can do is resign from their role in the Alberta government. That would help us have a vote of non-confidence or potentially switch governments today. That is something that they could help us do. Even if they weren't comfortable with going to another party, they could sit as an independent and it would serve the same purpose. Okay, so I'm going to, just before I get to the wonderful video that I did with Younis, just want to remind you that the reason why I'm here doing this is that there are people, there are places and plans to reclaim Alberta, and we need to work together to do that. And I want to help us create a better story together doing that. Okay, an action for you today, not today, but this week to take. I like to leave you with an action. The Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board meetings are in Calgary on Monday, February 23rd at the BMO Centre. And there is also one in Edmonton on the 25th. Please look at those. Please look to attend those. If you look at the SIFT ratings on those from the CPP investments, we are ranked really low, really high in fossil fuel investment. Again, this is not a message that is consistent with what Mark Carney is saying is important as Canadians, is to embrace the fact that we cannot just follow the United States anymore, that we have to think in terms of international law and following international policy. So in order to do that, we need to be divesting from fossil fuels. So this is a very big opportunity to help them understand that Albertans, people that are central in the oil and gas industry, understand the importance of phasing out those investments long-term in Canada. So that's a really big opportunity. Go to cppinvestments.com, public meetings, and you can find out about those and sign up for them. Please note that you have to register for those to attend them. The only other things I wanted to do before I share this is just share a couple of the, let me see if I can do this. I'm going to remove this one. Try that again. Okay, let's see. Try this. There we go. Okay, so this is what Danielle Smith has put out. I just have been mentioning, in fact, in that meeting that I did with Charlie about the video that Danielle Smith did last May, so May 2025. These are all sort of in line with what she promised for the province. So again, she wants to do unfettered pollution. That is the plan that she has for an independent Alberta, reminding us that international law does not dictate that to be within the economic or ecological boundaries of the planet. So it's really important that we have production caps, and that there are not production caps. Again, she's misleading with that language. The language was emissions caps. The oil and gas industry has promised that that could be done without reducing production. So it's, again, a misleading statement. She's saying no more consumer carbon tax. Well, the international market has carbon pricing. So, and again, the carbon pricing was invented by the oil and gas industry back in the 90s, when they should have been phasing out the development of the oil sands. They created that system and then realized that it was going to phase out the oil sands. So they decided to start spreading misinformation at that time instead. No more EV mandate. Well, she also was promoting having EVs come back into Canada from China so that the canola farmers could get their product out. And guess what? Carney has delivered on that. So she's kind of misleading there, that there will be EV vehicles coming. So I don't know what she's trying to suggest with that statement. No more export tax threats. I'm not sure what she's offering there, but I don't know who she's planning to export to, because if we do separate from Canada, the pipeline that we have through BC is suddenly in question. We don't have any plans to negotiate between us and the British Columbia government, especially when Canadians are subsidizing tolls, which those tolls have been put off until April. We're not we're not getting relief on those subsidies for oil and gas industries until at least April. So, these are the ways that the Canadians are supporting our oil and gas industry in Alberta. A new West Coast pipeline. Again, the goal is for the world to start phasing out oil and gas production. So to be building a new pipeline is not within the limits of what we can sustain on the land, nor does it fit in an economical time frame. So that would take 10 or 15 years to build, because it would be a new corridor. And it would be when oil is definitely seeing pressure to drop on a world stage. Tanker ban adjusted. Again, the Canadian waters are very shallow, and the tanker ban is in there for safety reasons. So I'm not sure what she's trying to achieve there. And then also that tanker ban was reasserted by the Indigenous communities in that area. So she's again testing true sovereignty, that is the sovereignty of First Nations people within Canada. Greenwashing provision removed. So this is her wanting to lie to us without any rules against it. So keeping in mind that when the rules were set in place, the Pathways Alliance and all of its members removed all of the language they had around net zero objectives, which was essentially confirming that carbon capture and storage is not a legitimate solution for mitigating further oil and gas development. And what that does is basically say that she wants to be able to lie and keep polluting and keep producing despite everything that you want. Oh, and then also that she wants to help us be more pollutive by creating more toxic plastics and being okay with just not labeling them. So again, this is the way that we would be led if we were to become an independent Alberta, just being clear. And one other thing I wanted to show you was this one. This one's been going around. So here's what life would look like as in an independent Alberta. You would pay less tax and keep more of your money. Okay, so again, you pay tax on things that you buy and you pay tax on your work. So I'm not sure how we would suddenly have a better tax regime outside of Canada, unless, of course, as of course we've heard from Rath, who's been leading this, the US is looking to back this. So we would be absorbed by the United States. And I think this is suggesting that we would then pay less tax. Of course, we'd get less services because that's what happens there's a cost to that. And there isn't. That's why she's leaning towards a two-tier public system in Alberta as it exists, which we are fighting as well. So yeah, you might pay less tax, but you get less for that. So let's be clear. Our 47 billion. So this is talking about the oh my goodness, I can't think of the name of it right now, but how we balance our budgets across the provinces. So she's suggesting we'd save 47 billion. Again, I'll just use the pipeline because that's the easiest thing in my mind. Canadians paid $36 billion to build that pipeline, and we have paid nearly 28 billion to subsidize the flow of that pipeline since it's been in operation. That is the TMX, the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Our economy would boom with oil and gas and agriculture. Again, our agriculture system is very much subsidized by the federal government. So I don't know where those dollars would come from for our agriculture irrigation system that we get subsidized from a federal perspective, as Alberta is considered one of the biggest food producers in Canada. And so I'm not sure how that booms when you're getting a ton of subsidies from out of province. It doesn't make sense to me. Investment will flow in. We're seeing investment flee. Again, they stopped the renewable investment, which they're about to announce I think a bigger than a $6 billion deficit for this year, if not higher. They've been warning us that we're about to see a huge deficit. So again, this is while they are in charge. They have been blowing money and not saving it. And they forewent $33 billion worth of investment. So we would be in the green had we simply allowed ourselves to invest in renewables. Instead, she's blocked landowners from recouping gains on their land through investment in renewables. You'll raise your kids without a woke propaganda in the classroom. If you go back to that last image I just showed you, she wants to be able to lie to you. So that woke propaganda, I think what she means is the environmental education that we should be teaching our students, and they're holding us back from doing. Mass immigration policies from Ottawa. Again, Alberta has a disproportionately high migration policy. So the Alberta government has been requesting people from out of province to move here. So they've been creating a local crisis for affordability crisis, let's say, from people coming from out of province and blaming it on the federal government. So again, that's something she's done intentionally, or they've done intentionally. You're right, your voice will matter in elections. So again, our rights are being taken from the people that are in charge right now. So no, our voice will not actually matter to them. They've made that very clear to us. Our rights and freedoms will be protected. Again, they've taken away our right to strike, our right to negotiate, and our right to fight for safe conditions, even when that comes to children. So again, really big no here. And your homework, your land, and your values will be respected. I don't know what those values are. It sounds like it's just polluting and producing oil and gas. And our culture and identity, no, they've stepped over the fact that First Nations have said no to this unconstitutional question of separation. So I just wanted to highlight some of the ways that we are being misled in social media actively. It's very clear that Facebook is helping these conversations happen in this way. So wherever you look at your social media, please know that there is some nefarious actors behind some of these messages, and it's really important to think about what they are saying, what they're really saying when you string them together. Okay, that's plenty. I have a wonderfully you were down at the Royal Canadian. Here we go. So I have a wonderful conversation that I'm about to share with you. Younis Alila was in town, as I said, presenting his movie called Trouble in the Headwaters. It was a fabulous screening. You can watch it on YouTube. I will include it as well as the press release that just came out about his latest paper in this video online when I share it on Substack. So check it out there. Again, please remember to like and subscribe to The Gravity Well, reminding you that all of the great work that people are doing in Alberta and in the rest of the world that I have an opportunity to speak to really need our help in getting their message out. Talk about these things, as Younis says, use your voice as professionals, as people who care. And yeah, I really hope you enjoy this as much as I did speaking with Younis. I hope you have a great rest of your day when this is over. I will be here in the background, though. If you do have any questions as it's running live, I'm happy to field those. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with me here. We're in the Bean and Green in Montgomery. Thank you for taking time after presenting in Calgary yesterday. You were down at the Royal Canadian Legion presenting Trouble in the Headwaters. Can you back up and remind everybody what your experience is, what your knowledge base is, your background for us before we start, Younis?
Yes, so my name is Younis Alila, and I am a professional engineer in training with a civil engineering background. All my university degrees are in civil engineering. My grad studies are in the science of extremes and the science of floods and droughts and precipitation extremes. I moved to BC because I got a job offer in 1992 with Metro Vancouver. And then after working as a professional engineer in the field of urban hydrology, I was hired in 96 by the Faculty of Forestry at the University of British Columbia. Now it's called the Faculty of Forestry and Environmental Stewardship. It has changed name in the last few months. And I've been working, teaching and doing research in forest hydrology since 1996.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting how you got into this. Like you were reminding folks last night that because you have an engineering background, it was really unique that you were hired at UBC. That different perspective that you brought in. I think you said you had different tools or a different approach. potentially you asked a different question. Maybe that's what you said. Can you just highlight that before we get into the details?
We need to do research in the field of that particular position, which in my case forest hydrology, and we need to teach undergrad and graduate students doing research in forest hydrology. The analyses that I was doing of existing long-term flood data, pre and post logging, the analyses led to diametrically opposite conclusions to well-established perception or wisdom, quote unquote, in over a century of forest hydrology literature. The method that I've been using revealed a flood regime that is much more sensitive to the clear-cut logging that we've been doing in BC and Alberta and everywhere else in Canada. It's much more super sensitive than the old method. The old method that guided forest hydrologists for over a century and counting underestimate dramatically the effect of the clear-cut logging on floods, and particularly larger floods. The old perception, well established in the forest hydrology literature for over a century, led them to think that the clear-cut logging may affect small and medium floods, but not necessarily the large and the very large. But the methodology that I've used actually reversed that diametrically, 360 degrees. Mm-hmm. So the method that I have been using was guided by a totally different question that guided the forest hydrology literature for over a century. The method that I have been using and advocating for the last 20 years is evaluating not only the effect of logging on the severity of the floods, but also the effect of logging on the frequency of the floods. Because as it is the case for any extremes, whether storms or hurricane or atmospheric rivers, or even wildfire, temperature extremes. These extremes, when they are affected by disturbance of any kind, are more likely to be increasing in severity. That's the magnitude of the event, how big the event is. But also, the disturbance will make these events more frequent. And that's exactly what we have been experiencing when it comes to the effect of climate change on weather extremes. The weather extremes of the past are now becoming the norm of today, but when it comes to the scientific framework and method of analyzing pre and post disturbances of the extremes, the same applies to the effect of land use and land cover practices on the land on those extremes. In the same way, climate change can make the floods more severe and more frequent. Say clear-cut logging and urbanization and agricultural practices could also make not only the floods more severe, but also more frequent. Not only the floods more severe, the landslides more severe, but also more frequent. Same framework, same concept.
You're talking about measuring the size of a flood, and you're talking about measuring how often flooding happens.
Yes.
So, and what you're finding from this community, the forestry community that's been consistent over the last 100 years, you were saying, is that they're only looking at the magnitude of the floods and they're not considering the increased frequency that is happening with it. And it's similar from my perspective as somebody who worked in the oil and gas industry and became a liability expert, so aware of the land use involved with oil and gas. Is oftentimes the problem, the climate change problem, is framed as an emissions problem and not as a land use and water deprivation problem as well. So to me, it's the understating of the problem in which the practice of clear-cut logging is justified. Is that a fair way to say it?
Yes.
Okay.
That old framework that misguided forest hydrology literature not only is not designed to tell us anything about how the logging may be making those events more frequent, but also it leads to the incorrect effect on the magnitude of the event.
Right, of course.
And in the process, unfortunately, in over a century of literature in forest hydrology ended up underestimating the power of forest in mitigating flood risk,
That's right.
drought risk, and landslide risk.
Yeah, it's undervaluing the importance of forests to hold our ecosystems intact. So we have clear-cut logging happening in our headwaters. So that puts us uphill where we are hoping to have snow land stay in place and recharge the canopy that's there. So that water ends up being, we call it water towers here. That's our framing for it, so that it's where we get most of our water stored long term. So when we clear cut log, we take away, first of all, that storage capacity of those trees, but then we also leave the land exposed, which allows both, the heat to penetrate and not allow that snow to stay in the trees, in those roots. But then it also provides ways for the land to start degrading, so to start eroding, let's say, and then those get into our rivers and streams. So that's a very basic way of describing it, but now it's compounding. We do that in several areas. You showed in your movie the trouble in the headwaters, one basin, and you mentioned it was on all sides of the basin, clear-cut logged upstream, obviously. So can you describe that a little bit better for the folks as to what I just said?
Old forest that we used to have, the primary of the old growth that we continue to log, we're running out quickly of these old growth of primary, particularly in the snow environment, but even in the rain. But in the snow environment particularly, they do intercept snow. When the old forest that we used to have intercepted the snow, the intercepted snow have a chance to evaporate back into the atmosphere between snowstorms. When the snowpack builds under the canopy of the old forest, we have less snow, right?
Of course.
But when we when we clear cut the old forest, in the cut block, we're going to have 10%, 20%, up to 30% more snow in the cut block.
Fair enough.
That in itself, more volume that need to be drained by the channel network. That's the first mechanism associated with clear cut log. The second mechanism, this is snowpack that builds under the old forest that we don't have anymore because of total clear cutting, is shaded by the canopy. When the snowpack is shaded by the old forest that we used to have, the snow melts slowly. When it melts slowly, it has a chance to, the melt has a chance to infiltrate into the soil, and slowly. When the melt infiltrates into the soil, especially mid to high elevation of the mountains in the headwater, it recharges the groundwater below the ground. That recharge from the melt and or the rain from under the forest happens over several months, mid to high elevation.
Right.
Takes months to actually reach the lowland. That deeper groundwater recharged from the higher elevation from the snowpack under the forest end up feeding the channel system in the lowland, and that comes in handy during the driest periods of the year. That's how the forest end up feeding the channel during the driest periods of the year, and that is how the old forest ended up reducing drought risk. It's through that mechanism. Now, if you remove the trees, then the snowpack in the cut block is going to be subject to much more solar radiation, much more wind, and the energy that comes with the wind. The snowpack in the cut block is melting quicker down into the river, out to the ocean or to the receiving water bodies. And we lose the opportunity of the recharging of the groundwater table. Associated with the clear-cut logging is the effect of roads. Roads are notorious in intercepting subsurface flows, because when the snow melt or the rain infiltrate into the soil, travel below the ground, long distances to reach the groundwater table and the aquifers and the channels, lots of roads used to access the timber. Those roads are constantly now intercepting through the cut bank what used to be subsurface or below ground. It's becoming now surface runoff, is now channeled into the ditches draining the river, the roads. The ditches are drained by culverts running under the forest roads. The culverts are connected to an existing gully or small streams out to the ocean and out to receiving body quickly. That's all at the expense of recharging the groundwater table, because the subsurface runoff is being intercepted. The forest canopy that we used to have, and now we lost it to clear-cut logging, is actually consuming groundwater for regrowth, for metabolism. When we log the trees are not there to relieve the soil from moisture for the next melt season or the next storm coming up. Therefore, when the next storm or the next melt season come up, the runoff is going to find wetter soil. And therefore, we're going to have higher runoff in the channel. So these are the mechanisms involved in increasing flood risk and drought risk. And when we say increasing flood risk and drought risk, I think the audience should be reminded that the floods and the droughts have 5 attributes. The severity of the flood, how big the flood event is. What's the frequency of occurrence of this floods, meaning how commonly it occurs, right? Some floods happens once in 100 years. Some floods happens 1 in 50 years. Some floods happen on average once in 20 years. Some floods happen once in every other year. Now, the same. So these are the 2 attributes: the magnitude, the frequency, the duration of the floods or the droughts, right? The flashiness of the flood, how quick the flood level rise in the river system. That's the flashiness. Yes, so the 5 of them, right? This applies to droughts. This applies to geohazards in general, all extremes, even wildfire. Wildfire events are associated with severity, frequency, duration, spatial extent, etc. Right? So it's the same mechanism. Extremes are extremes, and they're subject to the same framework, and therefore they need to be analyzed through the same methodology, basically.
So this is so fascinating. This I was saying offline, as the geophysics community, oddly, is the one to support your papers. That's where you've seen the most publication, correct? And it's because those are the 5 things that we look at in our work as well, right? We look at the time, the frequency, the amplitude, the phase, and the spatial components of it. So this is, to me, it's base principles of our work as geoscientists. So it's just so fascinating that the forestry industry is not held to those same principles of science. But you've thankfully brought that to light for people.
For 20 years, focusing on the effect of clear-cut logging on floods have revealed the flood regime. And when I say the flood regime, it means the whole range of floods, from small to medium, the large, the very large, and the apocalyptic. The entire flood regime is super sensitive to the sort of clear-cut logging, sort of forest practices that we've been doing for the last 50, 60, 70 years. And we continue to do so. And it is that older framework that actually was not designed to tell anything about the frequency and how the logging is making the floods more frequent, that ended up underestimating a great deal the effect of this clear-cut logging on the flood risk and the drought risk as well. So basically, the new methodology is actually revealing that all the floods are becoming more frequent: small, medium, large, very large, and the apocalyptic. And the larger the event, the bigger it is becoming, and the larger the event, the more frequent it becomes. Now, the sort of clear-cutting, indiscriminate clear-cutting across watersheds of all sizes, mostly in the form of clear-cutting, is making the 100-year, what we used to experience once every 100 years on average, now it's making it once every 10 years, once every 5 years. Therefore, the clear-cut logging is making the extreme of the past, the very large events of the past, becoming the norm of today. And that's all, unfortunately, in the background of an intensified climate by global warming. So therefore, the entire ecosystem, downstream community watersheds supplying water for domestic water use, are being subject to very different flood regimes. Entire landscape in BC and Alberta, across all of Canada, is now sitting at very heightened risk to floods, to droughts, to landslides. And of course, that has major implication on fish in the streams, on water quality in what we call community watersheds. These are watersheds that are used for domestic water supply. When the floods are becoming more frequent, they last over longer duration, they are bigger in size, and this happening for the small, medium, large, and very large events, those high flows are going to carry more sediments from the headwaters. But that sediments, particularly the fine sediments, is going to travel to the lowland where it passes through rivers that are crossing often urban areas. When the runoff coming from the headwaters, that at times 10 kilometers upstream, 100 kilometers upstream, sometimes 1,000 kilometers upstream in the headwaters that have been clear-cut logging to death, it's going to carry a lot of fine sediments. That fine sediments, as it passes through rivers and they get bit larger, these rivers, is going to actually settle down at the bottom of these rivers. When that fine sediment settles down, it's a process we call siltation. The fine sediments are going to actually fall to the bottom of the channel. The bed of the channel is going to go up full with sediments, and that sediment are choking the carrying capacity, the flow carrying capacities of the channels. If the channels are diked, that increases the risk of the dikes breaching themselves,
Right.
and then flooding the communities that are supposedly protected by these dikes.
Yes. So, you and I were talking about last night, somebody rightly said, why do people care about this, right? So what you're describing is people should care about this, not only from a food source perspective. We should be appreciating that when our rivers are choked off, that means that our food supply, in a sense, is being choked off, especially if you're thinking of this from the indigenous rights perspective. That's access to local food sources, right? Fundamentally. And then also for farmers, as that happens, as the carrying capacity of rivers are struggling, that means there's less water getting to those channels, those rivers for the farms. So if you're a farmer, you care about this because you want more water storage capacity in the forest. You want to make sure that you're going to have that water long term. If you're somebody living in a community, you care about this because the mitigation that has been done, and we can start talking about that more, Younis, you can help explain this a bit more. But the tendency is to address flooding and drought risk with either channeling or dikes or dams or more channels for irrigation, for example. And because they are understating the problem, because they are not recognizing the compounding impact of logging, they're not acknowledging that water is depreciated over time from the removal of our headwater forests. So I guess, can you talk about the current practices that are happening to mitigate for flood or drought? Because you're talking about an increased frequency, increased magnitude. They're unlikely to be effective long term, but then they're also a waste of money because we should be spending money on upstream, as you described. Can you expand on that a bit?
The flood management strategies adopted by many governments worldwide, certainly in British Columbia, I'm sure in Alberta as well, has been designed in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s. And they rely heavily on engineering structures, building dikes, raising the dikes, building higher bridges, bigger culverts. Most of these infrastructures are in the lowland. And therefore, we've been consumed or obsessed from an engineering perspective with building bigger infrastructures. But the bigger infrastructures, we know for sure, have failed us.
Right.
Even without climate change, the bigger infrastructure have failed us.
Right, like the old man down.
Yes, and it has failed us miserably. Nobody can actually deny that. Those bigger infrastructures are really treating the symptoms, not the root cause of the increase in flood risk. The root cause of increase in flood risk in the lowland and the more populated areas and the urban areas, the root cause of the increase in flood risk is really in the headwaters. And it is in the headwaters that we have been excessively clear cutting. We have excessively and unsustainably losing our older growth, which is our most powerful protection against both flood risk and drought risk. Continuing to be obsessed with size of this infrastructure, be obsessed with the engineering solution to attempting to manage and reduce the flood risk in the lowland without paying attention to what we're doing in the upland in terms of land use cover change and forest cover change, we're going to continue on a loss journey. We are going to continue losing taxpayers' money without meeting the objectives of these flood management strategies.
Right.
The only way around it is, yes, use engineering structures in the lowland, but don't just focus on making them bigger. Design them not just for size, but also for strength. They need to be more robust to sustain the fact that the extremes of the past are now becoming the norms of today. These downstream infrastructure are being battered by events less than their capacity, design capacity, becoming much more frequent. So therefore, engineering structures moving forward need to be designed not just for size, but also for strength. And I would emphasize designing them for strength is more important than designing them for size, because making them bigger will not save downstream community and downstream values.
Right.
The second aspect of it, we cannot rely on just the engineering structure in the lowland, in the downstream more populated area. We need to make sure we rehaul and redesign our management of the land and the forest in the headwaters. And therefore, we couldn't possibly continue to decimate and lose the forest cover, our most powerful protection against an increase in flood risk, mid to high elevation, right? We cannot continue doing that as if that's not the source of an increase in the flood risk.
Right. I'm picturing, you know, the movie Indiana Jones, where the first one where they're digging in the wrong place.
Yes.
It's kind of the same idea. They're solving a problem downstream when if they don't address the problem upstream, this problem downstream is never going to get solved.
Yes.
And also, like you said, they're using materials and design for something that is not as intense as what they understand the future to be. They're not looking at that frequency.
I think we are in denial if we continue managing flood risk in the way we have been for the last 50, 60 years. And it's really terrible, particularly in the Anthropocene, the era of an intensified climate and an intensified land use and land cover change. Our only hope to redesign and rehaul the way we actually manage the forest. Now we have lost most of our older growth, unfortunately, and now we started managing second growth. We're now logging, clear-cut logging the second growth, which means really we're not learning from our terrible experience that have created a mess that we're now experiencing. Perhaps we couldn't possibly have big say in actually curtailing the emission of CO2 in the atmosphere. The least thing we could actually do is to actually make sure our land use and our management of the land use and management of the land cover and the forest cover is up to date and takes into consideration the fact that the forest cover is our most powerful protection against all of these calamities, including wildfire.
Yes, yes. So this is what's so fascinating is that our forests, our old growth forests, also have a high biodiversity component too. They contain the most biodiversity as well. So in this exasperating effort, because as you're saying, it's not like we were clear-cut logging and we've improved our clear-cut logging practices. We have continued clear-cut logging, and we're going to less returns for the forest industry. Like West Ratio wrote down nearly $1 billion worth of logging this past year. I saw it in the Vancouver Sun, because they can't sell this product because they are logging such a poor quality log at this point, because they don't have the old growth forest. They're down into immature stands which don't produce timber. They only can produce OSB, and the demand for that product is also gone down. So there is an argument, even from the forestry perspective, that this is not an economic model anymore either. And so we're exasperating a problem when it really is not an economic prospect to begin with. So the way they are able to proceed in this model of clear-cut logging is because they look at a certain metric we were talking about yesterday. So the ECA, the equivalent cut values. So we were talking, or you were explaining that this ECA is the basis of all the decisions around forestry and how they are able to, narrow the scope of a project, let's say, and not really measure the impacts of what they're doing broadly. Is that fair?
Yes. The only reason why we continue to do forest practices only in the form of clear cutting. The clear cutting means you just shave the land, basically. You take everything, the trees that have wood value and the trees that don't. But when you are after the bigger trees that have wood value, but in the process, you shave and remove the small and medium trees that are 10 and 20 and 30 and 40, 50 years old. And when you're shaving the land by removing the small and medium-sized trees, you're losing 30, 40 years of regrowth. Right. The coniferous trees that we replant by law after clear cutting are very slow to recover. The science have shown that if you're logging primary and logging and all the growth forest, the secondary growth forest is not going to be the same. Forget about it. And it takes at least 60, 80 years for the replanted and naturally regenerated forest and the cut block to regain some substantial hydrologic functionality that will mitigate the water and mitigate the floods and droughts. In the background of global warming, the coniferous trees would have much tougher time regrowing. So it's going to grow slower if ever, especially on south exposed and west exposed slopes. Therefore, the regen will have very difficult time regrowing. And therefore, the only reason why they continue to do clear cutting, because it's the cheapest way of logging the trees, which means more money in the pocket of the industry. But governments at all levels, from the feds to the provincial, to the regional, to the municipal, need to realize that that clear-cut logging, although it creates some jobs and temporarily, comes at a big cost.
Right.
Comes at a big cost to the health of the watershed ecosystem, at a big cost to downstream community, at a big cost to fish industry, at a big cost to tourism industry, at a big cost to the downstream infrastructure. It has a cost to human lives, landslides and floods and stuff like that. It increases the premium, the insurance premium of downstream housing and residential districts. Many people who own houses and properties are now suddenly not being insured by insurance company because of the increase in flood risk. The government agencies at all levels continue to scapegoat the increase in flood risk on climate change, when in fact, I'm not a climate change denier, absolutely not. But the fact remains, I'm telling that clear-cut logging and the excessive indiscriminate clear-cut logging across watersheds of all size are making the 100-year flood event 10 and 20 times more frequent across watersheds of all size. And that is happening from the headwaters all the way to the lowland. It's about time governments at all agents, at all levels, recognize what the root cause of the problem of an increase in flood risk. It's about time that governments at all levels recognize that other governments across the globe have adopted policies of replanting the trees to actually mitigate against the effect of climate change on hydrology, on water, on floods, on droughts, when in fact we continue and aggressively, as if there is no tomorrow, to losing our forest cover to this nonsense clear-cut logging at the expense of taxpayers.
This is a great place to start talking about the recommendations. So there are certain jurisdictions like India, we talked about last night, in Europe, where they're, like you said, focused on forest regeneration. There is a model out there for us to look to globally, right? So what are some of the recommendations you have for our governments at all levels?
How should we be managing the second group? We should learn from our experience, and we should actually guide our policy and regulation related to forest practices by the proper science, by the defensible science, by the science that actually reveals the power of forest on mitigating flood risk and drought risk and landslide risk. But also the regulation and the policy regarding forest practices in the future need to abandon clear-cut logging in favor of the logging practices that are more eco-friendly and logging practices that actually reduce the effect on hydrology and the effect on water and the effect on flood risk. Do selective tree logging, do small patch cut logging, do strip cut logging, do logging with substantial enough retention, and stop spraying the deciduous trees to kill the deciduous trees because the deciduous trees have value, particularly as a fire retardant. Stop managing the forest without fire suppression, with the fire suppression. Indigenous way of actually managing the fire is the way to go. Stop replanting monoculture, right? And make sure when we replant diverse forest. Most importantly, though, we need to manage the forest in a way that appreciates the fact that the landscape in Canada and the climate in Canada is blessed with natural features that were designed by Mother Nature to mitigate hydrology, to mitigate floods, to mitigate landslides. The fact that our flood route hydrology is actually dominated by snow is a blessing of Mother Nature. Blessed Canada with a snow-dominated hydroclimate regime. Why? Because in a snow-dominated hydroclimate regime, the snow starts to accumulate in mid-October all the way to end of March, and we call that a perennial snowpack. And it starts melting slowly but surely in the spring. It takes months for that snow to actually melt slowly but surely, especially if the landscape is draped with forest, which delays the snow melt. When the snow melts slowly because the terrain is actually mountainous, in the mountainous terrain, the snow from the low elevation melts first, mid elevation melts next, higher elevation melts last. That's called desynchronized melt. And a desynchronized melts allow the runoff in the channel to be mitigated. And this is how the mountains actually end up mitigating flood level in the downstream rivers. In the mountainous terrain, some mountains are facing south and west. Some mountains are facing east and north. The snow from the west and south end up melting earlier, from the east and north melting later. That's Mother Nature mitigating hydrology for us, mitigating floods, mitigating droughts for us. And then therefore, all of Canada is blessed with lakes and wetlands all over the places of different sizes. These are created by Mother Nature to mitigate water, mitigate hydrology, mitigate floods, mitigate the droughts. Look what we're doing. We are clear-cut logging indiscriminately without taking advantage of the fact that logging on the west has a different effect from logging on the east facing slopes. Logging on the north will have a different effect from logging on the south facing slopes. Logging lower elevation have a different effect from logging mid to high elevation. Logging upstream of lakes and wetlands have a different. We are clear-cut logging indiscriminately across all elevation bands across wetlands, across lakes, indiscriminately, without taking advantage of what Mother Nature have provided Canadians and in the form of the landscape and the form of climate. These are called ecosystem services.
Right.
These are called nature-based solutions to mitigating our floods and droughts. And we come in and we actually, unfortunately, screwing it up big time. Therefore, future regulation and policy of logging must take into advantage the nature-based solutions. We could actually create logging practices that are designed not to synchronize the melt.
Right.
Logging practices that are designed to take advantage of the south-facing, west-facing, north-facing, take advantage of the lakes, of the beaver dams, etc. We could design logging scenarios in ways that actually take advantage of these natural features created by Mother Nature. You know what? This is the last quote that I have seen floating on LinkedIn. Floods and droughts are Mother Nature reaction to human betrayals. That's very powerful quote. It's not mine. It's of someone else, another scholar, right, from outside Canada. This clear-cut logging and indiscriminate clear-cut logging mid to high elevations in the headwater have major impact on agricultural practice, on farmers in the downstream community. Farmers in the Anthropocene and the era of global warming is increasing the severity and the duration of droughts, no doubt. But the loss of the forest cover indiscriminately in the headwater is actually exacerbating the frequency, the duration, and the severity of droughts in the downstream sections of the rivers, where the farmers need that water for irrigating during the dry periods of the year. Through the mechanisms involved in the clear-cut logging that exacerbate the droughts on the farmers downstream. When you clear-cut, and as a result of the clear-cut, you increase the flood risk, you automatically increase drought risk. Why? Because when you create the clear-cut, you lose that snow from the clear-cut quicker to the river system, to the ocean, to the receiving water body, at the expense of it recharging the groundwater table, which actually feeds the channels downstream, which is going to be used by the farmers to irrigate. When you actually replant the trees in the clear-cut, coniferous trees, the young coniferous trees that were replanted, for decades since they started growing, science have shown they consume 50% more groundwater than the old forest that was there before logging. Right. Because younger trees have bigger metabolism. It's like the teens. The teens eat way more than the elderly.
My metabolism is slow.
Yes, it's going down.
Yes.
Therefore, recent research, even older research, have shown that younger regions in the clear-cut, especially the coniferous, mid to high elevations, are consuming as much as 50% more than the older trees that actually were logged. But that's at the expense of the recharge of the groundwater table. If that does not make the droughts downstream more severe, I don't know what it does.
Right.
Again, the cut banks of the forest roads intercept subsurface road. But climate change is increasing. Climate change is causing the precipitation to fall in Canada more in the form of rain and less in the form of snow. But when the rain falls on melting snow, it exacerbates the snow melt. And we're going to lose quicker that snow in the cut block.
It goes back to your desynchronized water.
Exactly.
The natural capacity of that.
So therefore, the farmers should be the first
to be
concerned
yes.
about what the clear-cut and accessible clear-cut logging in the headwater is doing to their farming and to their irrigation practices in the lowland. And in Alberta, more so than anywhere else, even in BC, because agricultural practice is a bigger sector in the economy than it is in British Columbia.
Yeah, thank you. As it's one thing to stop, and we know that we need to stop clear-cut logging, but it's another thing for people to understand what we need to be asking for. And so what I heard you talk about was using the natural landscape properly. So not all land is equal, not all forests are equal. So use the science, make sure you're informing logging practices to support water desynchronization, as you described. So this is where what places are doing. So when I mentioned India, so what they're trying to do is slow water so that the forest can regenerate. So this is what you're describing, is we can plan forestry to mitigate against fire risk, let's say, but use the landscape to help design it so that the water actually stays in the ground and we can help that regeneration. Because you mentioned earlier, it takes 60 years to grow a forest the way we're doing it. If we do it differently, as you're describing, if we do it with the intention of planting more species, not just one species, allow that deciduous to be in amongst the coniferous trees, allow other natural grasses and other flowers and everything to help that forest grow faster. But then, as you rightly said, when you use the science, then you're also looking at the slope sides and you're looking at which side gets more sun and which side doesn't, and why it matters, where you plant and what will be success long-term for a whole watershed, rather than just looking at it at a one-off type of regeneration.
For 50, 60, 70 years, we paid lip service to impact assessment,
Yes.
to watershed assessment prior to logging,
Yes.
to cumulative effect studies. Anytime there is a development, whether urban development or mining or even agricultural practice, when there is major developments like that, usually they hire consultants before they implement the development to study the effect on the risk to hydrology, risk of landslide, risk of floods, risk on droughts, risk on sediments. But we don't do that when we have been doing clear-cut logging for 50, 60, 70 years.
Right.
We don't do that. But if we are extensively and indiscriminately clear-cut logging by default across watersheds of all size and reaching out to the higher elevation, what are we expecting? How could we possibly continue to do that without imposing on the industry to hire professionals to evaluate the risk proposed by their clear-cut logging?
Right.
And do cumulative effect studies? Because typically in any larger watersheds, you could have half a dozen logging companies clear-cut logging simultaneously with little coordination, no remorse to cumulative effect, and then they log and then they leave town. And they leave the province,
and then
they leave the country.
Right.
And then they leave the public and taxpayers on the hook for all the consequences. And therefore, I urge those who are in power, governments at all levels, to actually regulate cumulative effect studies.
Right.
The Blueberry First Nation have actually sued the BC government, and they won the lawsuit in the court, not through settlement,
Right.
and imposed on the BC government to actually do cumulative effect studies.
Right.
And they imposed the cumulative effect study not just on forest development, on oil and on gas, etc. Unfortunately, the BC government is still not doing it using the right framework, which is the science of extremes and the effect of these development, not only on the magnitude or severity, but also on the frequency of these events. But at least the court has made the case, and in the courtroom, and imposed and legislated cumulative effect studies. And I think these need to be done all over Canada, not just in British Columbia.
That's a great way to lead into our last part of this discussion, which is around how do we say no? How do we, as a community, help, especially as the scientific community, but also the general public? How do we help? Is there an effort from Albertans to help the BC government, let's say, understand the importance of hydrology and vice versa? You know, is there an opportunity for scientists from other jurisdictions? Because as you're describing, this is a Canadian-wide issue. Cumulative effects are a federal level policy, right? So this is something that impacts all of us as Canadians, these decisions. So that's why it's at that level of impacting, right? So from your perspective, what's the best thing for the public to do with this? You were discussing before we started, it's really important for the scientific community to talk about this and to make sure that the public is aware, but also what the ask is of the government. So you've already said we need the government to take seriously cumulative effects and impacts assessments for clear-cut logging. So that's one ask that we can ask of ourselves and the public to push back. Is there anything else you can offer in terms of, you know, we were talking about thresholds before we started. Anything that you think that we can use from what we're about to see, the things that we're about, like, I'm going to be specific again. Kelowna. You know, Kelowna has been clear-cut logged, excuse me, extensively around. They had their tremendous forest fire 2 summers ago. There's a ton of snow this winter in that basin, from what I understand. It's extremely likely there will be both extreme flooding and landslides because of the lack of intact forest in the uplands. Is that
And potential droughts after at the end of the summer and into the fall? Professionals from all walks of life. The biologists, the ecologists, the hydrologists, the geoscientists, the engineers, the professional, the PAGs. Professionals have a big role to play. All professionals who are registered in professional associations are actually mandated to protect the public and the environment. And therefore, they have a lot of power. And therefore, in my opinion, professionals have a big role to play in advising their clients, whether it's industry or government agencies at all levels, and make sure that their professional practices are up to date and using proper science. I think professionals need to speak up and speak out. And the difference between speaking up and speaking out is to a wider public, to the media. Speaking up is inside the closed rooms with their clients. I think professionals have a big role to play. We're all mandated by the Code of Ethics and Professionalism to actually protect the public and the environment. Scientists have a big role to play as well. Scientists are much closer to the literature than, right? This is the era of the Anthropocene. We cannot afford maintaining status quo. We have a role to play. We are responsible. We have a big responsibility on our shoulder to actually tell it as it is, speak up and speak out. But that's what I've been doing since the horrific November 2021 flood event in southwest British Columbia that have caused between 10 to $17 billion of damage and have triggered several class action lawsuits against the government. Class action lawsuits are actually multiplying as we speak in British Columbia. And I would not be surprised that would be the case moving forward because the science have advanced. The science, they call attribution science, which has been aggressively developed by climate change scientists. And attribution science is the same framework that evaluates the effect of disturbances on the magnitude and frequency of these extreme events. Is now being aggressively developed for 20 years by climate change scientists. And now it has been aggressively developed by climate change scientists to go after the industries that have polluted the atmosphere with CO2. There are now few cases that created precedences, but the same framework is now being used in hydrology, for instance.
Right.
Therefore, yes, therefore, the same attribution science is now being used and will be used even more aggressively in the near future to find out the extent to which a particular flood events, such as the 2018 flood event in Grim Fork, is actually yes or no caused by the excessive clear-cut logging in the last 30, 40, 50 years. in the river basin. The 2018 flood event in Grand Fork have damaged over 400 homes and businesses in Grand Fork and have triggered a class action lawsuit. It's still ongoing, but as far as I am concerned, and I have done a 5-year study in Kettle River Basin, which drains into the Grand Fork. And the Kettle River Basin is actually a headwater catchment of the Columbia. And I think the evidence is clear that the excessive clear-cut logging all over the Kettle River Basin, which is 10,000 square kilometer watershed, have actually caused the 2018 flood events. Therefore, the science have caught up with us. We need to catch up with science. We cannot deny the science anymore.
Right.
We should point it out, because my guiding principle is this: may the proper science, may the most up-to-date science guide our regulation and policy, as opposed to guiding the judges and lawyers deliberate in court.
Thank you. It's our responsibility as professionals to uphold our delegated responsibility, which is public safety. And right now in Alberta, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but our rights as professionals are being stripped from us. So I think it's really important for professionals who have the capacity, as you and I have obviously been compelled to stand against the business as usual practices, let's say. Anybody who is compelled to speak out needs to do it now. Now is the time. We are accelerating our destruction of the headwater forests through clear-cut logging practices, and it needs to stop. And when you go back to the principles that drove me to become a geophysicist, this is what we're asking of people, is to use the same technical capability we have to develop oil and gas assets, to look at our own landscapes and understand the impact on the surface in the Anthropocene today.
I was trained as an engineer. I was not trained as a scientist. I became a scientist by destiny, doing forest hydrology. But since I was forced to do science because I am holding an academic position, and because of how controversial and contentious forest hydrology have been for over a century and counting, for obvious reasons, I ended up being a non-mainstream scientist, because the outcome of my research is diametrically opposite to well-established dogma on how the forest is
and as
affecting.
you said, if you came up under the hydrology, like under that framework of education, you probably would have never accidentally discovered what you discovered.
Absolutely. It's because I came to practice forest hydrology as a scientist from outside forest hydrology culture and way of investigating hydrology. And because of that, I found out that forest hydrology have been and continue to be misguided, at least when it comes to the effect of this clear-cut logging on flood risk, drought risk, and landslide risk. Period. In general, across all science disciplines, non-mainstream scientists have been called all kinds of names. Non-mainstream scientists have given up on the peer review process because of the pushback they get from their own science community in the so-called anonymous peer review process. And these non-mainstream scientists giving up on the peer review process, many of them or most of them have decided to write their science outcomes in the form of bestseller books written for the wider public. I have not done that, and I have been using my professional designation of PEng, the professional engineering, to fight the system from within.
Engineers have a lot of power in this system, as you described.
Exactly.
So I appreciate you both understanding your power and your responsibility.
I am not doing this. I refuse to be labeled as an environmental activist. I refuse to be labeled as a tree hugger. I immigrated to Canada because I wanted to do my university studies in Canada. Therefore, unlike many of you, would be raised in the wood and in the forest and have a much better appreciation to the forest than I do. I didn't grow up with that feeling for the trees at all. And therefore, I stand up for the science.
I feel
I
the same
stand
way.
up for the science and for the professional practice, because the professional practice is meant to be guided by the proper science, by the defensible science.
And that's what falls apart. If we allow this as professionals, if we don't take seriously the principles of science, what role do we play?
Yes,
If we start pushing ourselves out of the equation, we start
Yes.
pushing our value
yes,
out, just as you were describing, and maybe this is a good way to start wrapping up, is we're not appreciating the value of the forest, and we're not appreciating the value of our professional capabilities as well too. So
even if I have feelings for the trees, it's none of anyone's business.
right. Because
None
let's
of
just let
anyone's
the
business.
science reign here. Like you
Exactly.
said, well, and this is the problem, is a lot of people take labels, and you're very wise to avoid being slapped a label on you and rather use your professional designation. I feel the same way. As much as I am, as you say, an environmentalist, like I grew up here and I've always cared about the environment. I grew up as an extractivist, if I'm being truthful. Like my family was, we all were in construction. That was, gravel, and then I went into oil and gas. So I was an extractivist, and now I appreciate the harms of that repeated activity. Like you said, if we're doing it thoughtfully, that's one thing. But if we're doing it destructively, that's where we need to make sure we stand against.
The farmers need to lobby their politicians.
Right, they have the power as well.
They have a lot of power. The public need to also lobby their own politicians, because they have the power on them, because they're going to be voting and making the decision. So I think every segment of the population have a role to play. Several months ago, I was approached by a journalist who works for The Guardian,
Right.
out of the New York office
Right,
of The Guardian.
fascinating, yeah.
And this journalist is actually from Quebec originally. And she approached me. She didn't just approach me, she approached 5 scientists from, and some First Nation people and some RPFs, foresters as well. So she wanted to talk to all of us one at a time, obviously, about this lake called the Lac Rouge in Quebec. Lac Rouge, in the middle of nowhere. The bank of the lake failed. There is a landslide on the bank of the lake.
Nice.
The lake has an elevated bank.
Right.
And that elevated bank on one of the sides, there was a landslide on it. And overnight, the big lake drained itself. No more. She sent me a consulting report investigating the incidents of the landslide that drained the lake, satellite imageries, as well as Google Earth imageries. And the Google Earth imageries and the satellite images are showing lots of clear-cut logging on both sides of the lake, as well as recent wildfires on both sides of the lake, 2019 and 2024. And the question that she asked me, this journalist, whether the landslide is a natural event or is an event caused by the disturbances in the form of loss of the forest cover, either through the clear-cut logging and or the wildfire on both sides of the lake. My answer to that was landslides, floods, and droughts can occur naturally with no disturbance.
Right.
But their severity and their frequency of occurrence, they become more severe and more frequent as a result of disturbances. We have similar incidences in the interior of British Columbia, in the so-called Caribou region, relatively flat topography, the Fraser rivers, the Chilcotin River, the Quesnel River. So these major rivers draining the interior plateaus, the Caribou region, have been actually sinking into the river. The banks of the river have been sliding into the river since the late 90s, all the way to now. Residential districts in the downtown of Quesnel, in the downtown of Williams Lake, These are two towns that are built on the banks of the Fraser River Basin. The land has been sinking on average 5 to 8 centimeters since the late 90s per year.
Based on that added sediment?
No.
Oh, just subsidence.
Subsidence. So these residential districts, the land underneath them has been sinking because they are built on the bank of the river, the Fraser River Basin, on the west side of the Fraser River. The subsidence of the land in the downtown area of Quebec, of Quesnel and Williamsdale, cumulatively since the late 90s all the way to now, 80 centimeters to 1 meter, the land has came down. The real estate lost its value in the downtown area of Quesnel and Williamsdale. The railway have actually been moving. The roads that, not the forest roads, but the paved roads have actually been sinking. The BC government have actually spent $1 billion fixing the landslides problems, and it's not being resolved. In August 2024, there was a landslide that blocked the Chilcotin River for a full week, and the water running downstream of the Chilcotin was not able to pass. The landslide created a dam, and the water backed up and created a lake upstream of the dam, 15 kilometers, right? And it created a panic because they were afraid that the dam would actually burst, and it created a surge. And luckily, after a panic that lasted for a week, in August 2024, the runoff after the break of the dam traveled all the way to Richmond and to the ocean with not as much harm as expected, but it could have been worse. But all these banks of the rivers, on the Chilcotin River and the Quesnel River and the Fraser River, have been sinking. As a result, some consultants, geotechnical consultants, were quick to blame climate change for the landslide regional problems. I actually told all of them that the Caribou region is the most decimated when it comes to the loss of the forest cover to conventional clear-cut logging, to salvage logging as a result of the beetle infestation, and more recently to wildfire. Yeah. And therefore, that's the area in British Columbia that have been more aggressively losing its forest cover. And the loss of the forest cover could be the main cause of the landslides on the banks of these major rivers. Therefore, I told the Guardian that we cannot possibly rule out an effect of the landslide on Lac Rouge bank that drained the lake. We cannot rule out the effect of the forest cover loss through wildfire and clear-cut logging. So that's the story in that was made.
Yeah, that's great, because I think that an equivalency here in Alberta would be the 2013 flood, which changed the landscape through Bragg Creek first, hugely. Where there was a bridge, it was no longer the river changed direction completely. So if you're somebody who is on a riverbank, banking on these mitigation practices that are happening, or that you're going to have lakefront property, let's say, in some of these lakes that are banked in the headwaters.
Knowing what I know about the 2013 flood event that created havoc, a historically big flood event in Alberta, knowing what I know about where the storm was centered, which is on the eastern slopes, knowing what I know, that it is a rain on a melting snow event, knowing what I usually know about hydrology, that mid to high elevation, we have highest precipitation in there in the form of snow melt and plus the precipitation, that all that headwater on the eastern slopes are draining the both rivers, the one that passes it through.
Low and Bow.
Yes, right? I would not, as a hydrologist, come hired to investigate. The loss of the forest cover in the headwaters of the eastern slope would be on top of my list of being a major contributor to the severity and the frequency and the duration of that flooding.
Yes, and then the mitigation would then include a plan to restore those schools. Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being a salmon, a salmon that landed in a sea of hydrologists. Or, sorry, I should say an engineering salmon of the sea of hydrologists. I'm so grateful for your work, Younis.
I would not want to be a salmon. Do you know why the salmon is suffering big time as a result of the excess of the clear-cut logging? It's not just the salmon, all the fishes, you know, in the channels.
Yes.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Again, I am so grateful for your work and I look forward to our continued collaboration, I'm sure.
Thank you.